Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal, the varietal literature. We're a group of Vancouver writers who just do things with narrative. And tonight we're going to be hearing old stories, so not stories I've written, and just kind of absorbing the ambiance and relaxing, let's be honest. This is a stream best heard well, yeah, make dinner or just lie on the couch and got home. It's that kind of thing. And maybe even just saving it for when you're going to sleep. So I can tell you an old lullaby or something like we used to do, or maybe your family did. GS says, Peekaboo, you've outdone yourself with your scene and gentle music. Well, thank you so much. I think I first and foremost put together things that I like. And then I hope that whoever comes along will agree that they are lovely. So what's our theme tonight? Because usually we read a few stories on this. Well, our theme tonight is Christmas. I can say it. I guess maybe not exactly Christmas. Winter celebrations. That's not me being, politically correct or whatever. It is worth acknowledging that the history and traditions of celebration around Christmas are incredibly complex, very interrelated in Northern Europe anyways. Well, not even just Northern Europe, Europe in general. And then, of course, that changes of seasons have always been a big deal from cultures to cultures. And almost every culture that I know of anyways, pretty much every culture I know of, has some sort of celebration around the change of the seasons. And yeah, I get it. We're not quite in winter yet, but it's very much wraps itself around the solstice. The solstice, if you don't know, is, unless I've misunderstood it for many years, which is entirely possible, is basically the longest day of the year, if I recall. And it marks a turning point, and it occurs sort of around what we in Canada traditionally call Christmas, or at least predominantly call Christmas. Now, GS says I'm knitting. I can't think of a more perfect thing to be doing with this stream. Now, we're going to do a couple of stories around winter and celebrations from the Scottish fairy book and the Swedish fairy book, which we read a bit last week. But before I do that, I just want to clarify some things, because we are mainly doing sort of Northern European fairy tales here. And again, the reason for that is that I am of Northern European descent, Scottish and Norwegian, a bit of Swedish and Irish. So, I don't feel like I feel like it's sort of a chance for me to explore my own roots, but I'm also not always the most comfortable reading other people's cultural works because I'll probably misunderstand them, and I don't want to push that out. But let's talk about some of the Northern European celebrations and how they interrelate, because they're going to come up in these stories. I'll do this as briefly as I can because we don't really try to be educational here. So, first of all, Yule, as in Yule tide, Yule log. Yule is a Nordic holiday that was probably somewhat related to Roman holidays. As far as I can tell, most people argue that a lot of the traditions we know as Christmas, especially out of Northern Europe and Germany and so on, came from the Romans around Saturnalia, which actually takes place a fair bit before midwinter. It's a midsummer festival, actually. And I never saw much of an explanation as to why it would get shifted to midwinter, but there were a lot of things in Saturnalia that carry over, like the decorating of a tree and bringing it for display. But there's also things, my best understanding of Saturnalia in Roman times was it was a sort of New Orleans Mardi Gras kind of atmosphere. It also had these ideas of it was the 12 days of celebration around being the same, everyone being of the same status, essentially. And so it was known that masters would serve their slaves their dinner at their tables and stuff. There was a lot of unexpected celebrations, and there was, including all of that, a tradition that gets pulled up into Irish and Scottish culture, at least, which is sort of the Feast of Fools and the what's his name, the Abbot of Unreason, I think is what it's called in Ireland. Sort of a king of the festival. Like I said, very Mardi Gras. So you have Saturnalias in Rome, which again is a midsummer festival that kind of a bunch of traditions like decorating trees and a few other things get pulled into that. Now, probably influenced by that, because they are a culture that was woven around Rome's occupation of areas as well, is Norse culture. And Norse culture has Yule, which is either Jul or Jol, depending on how you want to spell it, which is a whole complex thing around the solstice of winter, where you have these 12 days of celebration, and different days are committed to sort of different gods. I think Helena is the first day or something like that. I'm not a scholar on this at all, but from you'll get the sort of German traditions of Yule and Yuletide. Not exclusively German, but definitely was, especially for the stories we read and when they were collected, was most associated to Germany. So Yuletide and Yule kind of hit this point, and this is sort of why I'm bringing this up before we read these stories. They hit this point where they intermingle in such a way that when in language, in stories, if you reference Yule or Yuletide or Yule morning or whatever else, they're talking about Christmas in modern sense of the term. But it is technically a pagan festival name that they're referencing there. So and the reason for that, which I think everybody kind of knows, and if you don't, I will tell you, is when missionaries from the various Christian sects that were operating in that time, mainly Catholic, started spreading out. One of the ways that they were trying to win over pagan cultural traditions, people in pagan cultural traditions, is they would attach biblical stories to the pagan cultural traditions so that they would keep sort of the decorations and the metaphorically and literally decorations of their culture, but then they would reinterpret them into a praise of, their God in the Bible and all that. So the reason why all of that matters, and the reason why the timing works out the way it does, and what, again, I think most people know, is like, the 25th of December is pretty well agreed not to be the birth of Christ date. That was decided because that was a significant day for people that observed winter solstice. And I think most scholars, so this is digging into some old memories, I think most scholars say that the birth of Christ, as the Bible would tell it, is probably more like February or March or something like that. So the reason why it's important to know that is because the language kind of slides around. You're in a time where we're kind of transitioning from a time when it's still a lot of pagan culture and language traditions and cultural traditions into a time of more what we would recognize now, kind of a modern Christian sense. So with that in mind, I guess that's one way of trying to explain why Yule and Yuletide and all of that. You can just pretty safely assume that means Christmas. It is worth noting, though, that in some of these, they might be referring to actually 12 days of celebration that could be named that way. And that's all I'll say on that. Because, again, I don't think that's necessarily what people come here to hear. Some guy, half-knowledgeable guy, telling them about history of traditions. There are people that are better at that on YouTube, frankly, that you could go to. So the two books we're looking at then are the Scottish Fairy Book and the Swedish Fairy Book. And Scotland and Sweden are very, very closely related. There's just a little bit of water between them. So they are very distinct cultures, of course, but they actually have quite a bit in common. And I think one thing that you'll find interesting is the Scottish book, with its traditional tales, has moments where it makes reference to Nordic gods like Odin and so on. And given that, this is sort of my summary, given that the winter tradition of Yule is a lot of what they're drawing on when they're starting to build up new Christian traditions of Christmas, and given their close relationship and trading partners and whatever with Sweden and Scotland with Sweden, it's not surprising that it mixes in the way it does. Yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say on that. The only other thing I wanted to mention was that Scotland has its own language, as you probably knew. Some of them are language families shared with Irish traditional languages. And as a result, to this day, Scottish names, old names for things, are still used. So there's a couple of times in the Scottish stories where I will have to, I think, just tell you what that means in Canadian English, because they name things differently. And I quite like the language, but of course it doesn't mean anything to you if you don't know what it means. So, why don't we start with a Scottish story? After all, that is the majority of what I am. Okay. We want this, the wedding of Redbreast and Jenny Wren. Okay. In the preamble of this book, and I feel safe to say this, the preamble of this book, it talks about how Scottish traditional tales are long and don't really end. And let me tell you, as a person who grew up with people in a family that was majority Scottish, that is the nature of their stories. Lots of talking, usually complaining about other people who've wronged them, and not really having an ending. I think this story doesn't really have an ending the way you might think it, but the other story we're going to read from this, from the Scottish book, is I think more marked out as a one of the longer ones. I think it's actually pretty interesting. But anyways, here we go. This is from the Scottish Fairy Book, a traditional Scottish tale called The Wedding of Robin Redbreast and Jenny Wren. And right off the bat, we're going to have a name that I need to translate for you. There was once an old grey Pussy Baudron. Pussy Baudron is a cat. And she went out for a stroll one Christmas morning to see what she could see. And as she was walking down the burnside, she saw a little Robin Redbreast hopping up and down on the branches of a briar bush. What a tasty breakfast he would make, thought she to herself. I must try to catch him. So, good morning, Robin Redbreast, quoth she, sitting down on her tail at the foot of the briar bush and looking up at him. And where mayest thou be going so early on this cold winter's day? I'm on my road to the king's palace, answered the robin cheerfully, to sing him a song this merry Yule morning. That's a pious errand to be travelling on, and I wish you good success, replied Pussy slyly. But just hop down a minute before thou goest, and I will show thee what a bonny white ring I have round my neck. 'Tis few cats that are marked like me. Bonny, beautiful. If you don't know, bonny lass, it means beautiful. Bonny lass is bonny, beautiful girl. Bonny comes up a lot. Then Robin cocked his head on one side, looked down on Pussy Baudrons, and said, with a twinkle in his eye, "Ha, ha, grey Pussy Baudrons," he said, "ha, ha, for I saw thee worry the little grey mouse, and I have no wish that thou shouldst worry me." And with that he spread his wings and flew away, and he flew till he lighted on an old sod dyke, and there he saw a greedy old Gled sitting with all his feathers ruffled up as if he felt cold. Gled is a hawk. "Good morning, Robin Redbreast," cried the greedy old Gled, who had no food since yesterday and was therefore very hungry. "And where mayest thou be going this cold winter's day?" "I'm on my road to the king's palace," answered the robin, "to sing him a song this merry Yule morning." And he hopped away a yard or two from the Gled, for there was a look in his eye that he did not quite like. "Thou art a friendly little fellow," remarked the Gled sweetly, "and I wish thee good luck on thine errand. But ere thou go on, come nearer me, I prithee, and I will show you what a curious feather I have in my wing. 'Tis said that no other Gled in the countryside hath one like it." "Like enough," rejoined Robin, hopping still further away, "but I will take thy word for it, without seeing it. For I saw thee pluck the feathers from wee Linty, and I have no wish that thou shouldst pluck thy feathers from me, so I will bid thee good day and go on my journey." The next place on which he rested was a piece of rock that overhung a dark, deep glen, and here he saw a sly old fox looking out his hole not 2 yards below him. "Good morning, Robin Redbreast," said the sly old fox, who'd tried to steal a fat duck from a farmyard the night before, and had barely escaped with his life. "And where mayest thou be going so early on this cold winter's day?" "I'm on my road to the king's palace, to sing him a song this merry Yule morning," answered Robin, giving the same answer that he'd given to the grey Pussy Baudrons and the greedy Gled. "Thou wilt get a right good welcome, for his majesty is fond of music," said the wily fox. "But ere thou go, just come down and have a look at a black spot which I have at the end of my tail. 'Tis said that there is not a fox twixt here from the border that hath a spot on his tail like mine." Very like," replied Robin, "but I chanced to see thee worrying the wee lammie up on the braeside yonder, and I have no wish that thou shouldst try thy teeth on me. So I'll e'en go on my way to the king's palace, and thou canst show the spot on thy tail to the next passer-by." So the little Robin Redbreast flew away once more, and never rested till he came to the bonny valley with a little burn running through it, river. And there he saw a rosy-cheeked boy sitting on a log eating a piece of bread and butter. And he perched on a branch and watched him. "Good morning, Robin Redbreast. And where mayst thou be going so early on this cold winter's day?" asked the boy eagerly, for he was making a collection of stuffed birds, and he'd still to get a Robin Redbreast. "I'm on my way to the king's palace to sing him a song this merry Yule morning," answered the robin, hopping down to the ground, keeping one eye fixed on the bread and butter. "Come a bit nearer, Robin," said the boy, "and I will give thee some crumbs." "Na, my wee man," chirped the cautious little bird, "for I saw thee catch the goldfinch, and I have no wish to give thee the chance to catch me." At last he came to the king's palace and lighted on the window-sill, and there he sat and sang the very sweetest song that he could sing, for he felt so happy that it was the blessed Yuletide that he wanted everyone else to be happy too. And the king and the queen were so delighted with his song as he peeped in at them at their open window that they asked each other what they could give him as a reward for his kind thought in coming so far to greet them. We pardon me. Oh my, I think it's time for water. Before his wife sounds like she's hitting puberty. "We can give him a wife," replied the queen, "who'll go home with him and help him build his nest." "And who wilt thou give him for a bride?" asked the king. "Methinks 'twould need to be a very tiny lady to match his size." And there they are watching the little bird. I imagine that's a little hard to see on the stream, but it's a pretty photo. Or photo. Picture. "Why, Jenny Wren, of course," answered the queen. "She hath looked somewhat dowy of late. This will be the very thing to brighten her up." Then the king clapped his hands and praised his wife for her happy thought, and wondered that the idea had not struck him before. So Robin Redbreast and Jenny Wren were married, amid great rejoicings at the king's palace, and the king and queen and all the fine nobles and court ladies danced at their wedding for a bird. Then they flew away home to Robin's own countryside and built their nest in the roots of the briar bush, where he had spoken to Pussy Bottoms. And you will be glad to hear that Jenny Wren proved the best little housewife in the world. And that, believe it or not, is the end. I like the story. I don't know what it means. It's just be cautious, be nice to the king. He'll get you a wife. All right. We're going to come back to the Scottish book in a moment, but I'm going to switch us over to the Swedish fairy book. Just for one, this is a shorter one. We'll end on the Scottish book, which has a longer tale to it. The next Scottish tale, though, I will say, is about a real monument, and it's the real tale of that monument in Scotland. So stick around for that. But we're going to look at the Swedish fairy book for a moment, and a little one called The Yuletide Spectres. This carries in a tradition that is really common around Christmas, and I don't have a definitive explanation as to why, but a great deal of Christmas stories are about ghosts. And I realized that Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, my God, I don't know why that took so long to get out of my head, is the most famous ghost story that we have in our time about Christmas. But there actually is a whole tradition of telling ghost stories around Christmas. And to be honest, I don't quite know where it sources from. But this is one of the classic tales of Sweden, of a Swedish ghost story. about a Christmas Mass. It's called the Yuletide Spectres. Once upon a time there lived two peasants on a homestead called Vadarus, just as there were two peasants living on it now. In those days the roads were good, and the women were in the habit of riding when they wanted to go to church. One Christmas the two women agreed they would ride to Christmas night Mass, and whichever one of them woke up at the right time was to call the other, for in those days there was no such thing as a watch. It was about midnight when one of the women thought she had heard a voice from the window calling, "I'm going to set out now." She got up hurriedly and dressed herself so that she might be able to ride with the other woman. But since there was no time to eat, she took a piece of bread from the table along with her. In those times, it was customary to bake the bread in the shape of a cross. It was a piece of this kind that the woman took and put in her pocket, in order to eat it under way. She rode as fast as she could to catch up with her friend, but could not overtake her. The way led over a little stream which flows into Vidostern Lake, and across the stream was a bridge, known as the Earth Bridge, and on the bridge stood two witch trolls, busy watching. As the woman came riding across the bridge, one of the witch trolls called out to the other, "Hurry and tear her head from her shoulders." "That I cannot do," returned the other, "because she has a bit of bread in the form of a cross in her pocket." The woman, who had been unable to catch up with her neighbor, reached the church at Hanger alone. The church was full of lights, as was always the case when Christmas Mass was said. As quickly as ever she could, the woman tied up her horse and hurriedly entered the church. It seemed to her that the church was crowded with people, but all of them were headless, and at the altar stood the priest, in full canonicals, which is dress, but without a head. In her haste she did not at once see how things were, but sat down in her accustomed place. And as she sat down, it seemed to her that someone said, "If I had not stood godfather to you when you were christened, I would do away with you as you sit there. And now hurry and make yourself scarce, or it will be worse for you." And then she realized that things were not as they should be, and ran out hastily. When she came into the churchyard, it seemed to her as though she were surrounded by a great crowd of people. In those days, people wore broad mantles of unbleached wool, woven at home and white in color. She was wearing one of these mantles, and the spectre seized it. But she flung it away from her and managed to escape from the churchyard and run to the poorhouse and wake the people there. It is said it was then 1 o'clock at night. So she sat and waited for the early Mass at 4 o'clock in the morning, and when day finally dawned, they found a little piece of her mantle on every grave in the churchyard. A similar experience befell a man and his wife who lived in a hut known as Ingus below Moslid. They were no more than an hour ahead of time, but they reached the church at Hanger. They thought the service had already begun and wanted to enter at once, but the church was barred and bolted, and the phantom service of the dead was nearing its end. And when the actual Mass began, there was found lying at every place some of the earth from the graves of those who shortly before had been worshipping. The man and his wife thereupon fell grievously ill, because they had disturbed the dead. That's Smudge. Yeah. Well, I have awoken Smudge. Good timing, though, because that was the end of the that section. Okay. So that's A Swedish Tale. If I lost you anywhere, it's basically about ghosts that go to Christmas Mass before the earliest Mass. And I have a theory. It's a pet theory. I have a theory that there are people that show up early to Christmas Mass back then, and the priest was annoyed because they had probably a lot of setting up they have to do as it is, and he didn't like Keener showing up early. So I feel like they sort of made a tale about creepy ghosts being there if you got there too early, so you should just be there on time, not too early. I have no evidence for that. That's just my own theory, my own pet theory on this. All right. Which takes us back to our Scottish fairy book. And we are going to talk about the Dwarfy Stone, the tale of the Dwarfy Stone, which is a Christmas tale. It is a longer tale, though, so the first part isn't very Christmas oriented, but it becomes, the core of it is around Christmas. So don't feel like I've forgotten my own charge here. Now, the Dwarfy Stone, if you have access to a phone and you want to look up the Dwarfy Stone, it's actually called the Dwarfy Stain, or Stain, because of the accent. It's literally spelled Stane. And it's located on the island of Hoy, which is a place near Scotland there. Well, it's Scottish, but it's near Scotland mainland. And it is this old sort of abutment of stone in the middle of a fairly desolate field that has been carved out and made into a kind of tomb. And what's interesting about it is it's really only been seen in, like, I want to say Mediterranean areas you see them. It's one of the, I think it's the only one known to still exist or to even to have been found the remains of in Northern Europe. These kind of burial things. It's a hollowed out stone. It's a big hollowed out stone. So if you look it up, you can see it. This is the story of the Dwarfy Stain. The Dwarfy Stone. Far up in the green valley in the island of Hoy stands an immense boulder. It is hollow inside, and the natives of these northern islands call it the Dwarfy Stone, because long centuries ago, so the legend has it, Snorro the Dwarf lived there. Nobody knew where Snorro came from or how long he had dwelt in the dark chamber inside the Dwarfy Stone. All they knew about him was that he was a little man with a queer, twisted, deformed body and a face of marvelous beauty, which never seemed to look any older, but was always smiling and young. Men said that this was because Snorro's father had been a fairy and not a denizen of earth, who had bequeathed to his son the gift of perpetual youth. But nobody knew whether this was true or not, for the dwarf had inhabited the Dwarfy Stone long before the oldest man or woman in Hoy had been born. One thing was certain, however, he had inherited it from his mother, whom all men agree had been mortal. The dangerous qualities of vanity and ambition, and the longer he lived, the more vain and ambitious did he become, until at last he always carried a mirror of polished steel around his neck, into which he would constantly look in order to see the reflection of his handsome face. And he would not attend to the country people who came to seek help unless they bowed themselves humbly before him and spoke to him as if he were a king. I say that the country people sought his help, for he spent his time, or appeared to spend it, in collecting herbs and simples on the hillsides, which he carried home with him to his dark abode, and distilled medicines and potions from them, which he sold to his neighbors at wondrous high prices. Ooh, Scottish crime. He was also the possessor of a wonderful leathern-covered book, clasped with clasps of brass, over which he could pore for hours together, and out of which he would tell simple islanders their fortunes if they would. For they feared the book as much as they feared Snorro himself, for it was whispered that it had once belonged to Odin, and they crossed themselves for protection as they named the mighty enchanter. But all the time they never guessed the real reason why Snorro chose to live in the Dwarfy Stone. I will tell you why he did so. Not very far from the stone there was a curious hill shaped exactly like a wart. It was known as the Wart Hill of Hoy, and men said that somewhere in the side of it was hidden a wonderful carbuncle, which when it was found, would bestow on its finder marvelous magic gifts, health, wealth, and happiness, everything, in fact, that a human being could desire. And the curious thing about this carbuncle was that it was said that it could be seen at certain times, if only the people who were looking for it were at the right spot at the right moment. Now, Snorro had made up his mind that he would find this wonderful stone, so, while he pretended to spend all his time in reading his great book or distilling medicines from his herbs, he was really keeping a keen lookout during his wanderings, noting every tuft of grass or piece of rock under which it might be hidden. And at night, when everyone else was asleep, he would creep out with pickaxe and spade and turn over the rocks or dig over the turf, in the hope of finding the long-sought-for treasure underneath them. He was always accompanied on these occasions by an enormous gray-headed raven, who lived in the cave along with him and who was his bosom friend and companion. The islanders feared this bird of ill omen as much, perhaps, as they feared its master, for although they went to consult Snorro in all their difficulties and perplexities, and bought medicines and love potions from him, they always looked upon him with a certain dread, feeling that there was something weird and uncanny about him. Now, at the time we are speaking of, Orkney was governed by 2 earls, who were half-brothers. Paul, the elder, was a tall, handsome man with dark hair and eyes like sloes. All the country people loved him, for he was so skilled in knightly exercises, and had such a sweet, loving nature, that no one could help being fond of him. Old people's eyes would brighten at the sight of him, and the little children would run out, greet him as they rode by their mothers' doors. And this was the more remarkable because, with all this winning manner, he had such a lack of conversation that men called him Paul the Silent, or Paul the Taciturn. Harold, on the other hand, was as different from his brother as night is from day. He was fair-haired and blue-eyed. He gained for himself the name Harold the Orator because he was always free of speech and ready with his tongue. But for all this he was not a favorite, for he was haughty, jealous, and quick-tempered, and the old folks' eyes did not brighten at the sight of him. And the babes, instead of toddling out to greet him, hid their faces in their mothers' skirts when they saw him coming. Harold could not help knowing that the people liked his silent brother best, and the knowledge made him jealous of him, so a coldness sprang up between them. Now, it chanced one summer that Earl Harold went on a visit to the King of Scotland, accompanied by his mother, the Countess Helga, and her sister, the Countess Falkirk. And while she was at court, she met a charming young Irish lady, the Lady Morna, who had come from Ireland to Scotland to attend upon the Scottish Queen. She was so sweet and good and gentle that Earl Harold's heart was won, and he made up his mind that she, and only she, could be his bride. But although he had paid her much attention, Lady Morna had sometimes caught glimpses of his jealous temper. She had seen an evil expression in his eyes, and had heard him speak sharply to his servants, and she had no wish to marry him. So to his great amazement, she refused the honor which he offered her, and told him that she would prefer to remain as she was. Earl Harold ground his teeth in a silent rage, but he saw that it was no use pressing his suit at that moment. So what he could not obtain by his own merits, he determined to obtain by guile. Accordingly, he begged his mother to persuade the Lady Morna to go back with them on a visit, hoping that when she was alone with him in Orkney, he'd be able to overcome her prejudice against him and induce her to become his wife. That sounds very menacing. And all the while he never remembered his brother Paul, or if he did, he never thought it possible that he could be his rival. But That was just the very thing that happened. Lady Morna, thinking no evil, accepted the Countess Helga's invitation, and no sooner had the party arrived back in Orkney than Paul, charmed with grace and beauty of the fair Irish maiden, fell head over heels in love with her, and the Lady Morna, from the very first hour that she saw him, returned his love. Of course, this state of things could not long go on hidden, and when Harold realized what had happened, his anger and jealousy knew no bounds. Seizing a dagger, he rushed up to the turret where his brother was sitting in his private apartments, and he threatened to stab him to the heart if he did not promise to give up all thoughts of winning the lovely stranger. But Paul, Paul, Silent Paul, Paul met him with pleasant words. "Calm thyself, brother," he said. "It is true that I love the lady, but that is no proof that I shall win her. It is likely that she will choose me, whom all men name Paul the Silent, when she hath the chance of marrying you, whose tongue moves so swiftly that to you is given the proud title of Harold the Orator." At these words, Harold's vanity was flattered. He thought that, after all, his stepbrother was right, and that he had a very small chance, with his meager gift of speech, of being successful in his suit. So he threw down his dagger, and shaking hands with him, begged to pardon his unkind thoughts, and went down the winding stairs in high good humor with himself and all the world. By this time it was coming near to the Feast of Yule. See, I told you we would find Christmas in this story. And at the festival it was the custom for the Earl and his court to leave Kirkwall for some weeks, and to go to the palace of Orfeur, 9 miles distant. And in order to see that everything was ready, Earl Paul took his departure some days before the others. The evening before he left, he chanced to find the Lady Morna sitting alone in one of the deep windows of the great hall. She had been weeping, for she was full of sadness at the thought of his departure, and at the sight of her distress, the kind-hearted young earl could no longer contain himself, but folding her in his arms, he whispered to her how much he loved her, and begged her to promise to be his wife. Well, she agreed willingly. Hiding her rosy face on his shoulder, she confessed that she had loved him from the very first day, and that she had seen him, and ever since that moment she had determined that if she could not wed him, she would wed no other man. For a little time they sat together, rejoicing in their new-found happiness. Then Earl Paul sprang to his feet. "Let us go and tell the others the good news to my mother and brother," he said. "Harold may be disappointed at first, for I know, sweetheart, he would fain have had thee for his own, but his good heart will soon overcome all of that, and he will rejoice with us also." But the Lady Morna shook her head. She knew better than her lover, what Earl Harold's feelings would be. She would fain put off the evil hour. "Let us hold our peace till after Yule," she pleaded. "It will be a joy to keep our secret to ourselves for a little space. There will be time enough then to let the world know." Rather reluctantly, Earl Paul agreed, and next day he set off for the palace at Orfeur, leaving his lady love behind him. Little he guessed the danger he was in, for all unknown to him, his step-aunt, Countess Fraukirk, had chanced to be in the hall the evening before, hidden behind a curtain, and she had overheard every word that Morna and he had spoken, and her heart was filled with black rage. Well, she was a hard, ambitious woman, and she had always hated the young earl, who was no blood relation to her, and who stood in the way of his brother, her own nephew. For if Paul were only dead, Harold would be the sole Earl of Orkney. And now that he had stolen the heart of Lady Morna, whom her own nephew loved, her hate and anger knew no bounds. She had hastened off to her sister's chamber, and as soon as the lovers had parted, there were two women, the two women had remained talking together till the chilly dawn broke in the sky. There is a beautiful picture. Pardon me. I believe that is of Lady Morna with Paul. Oh no, that's Frau Kirk behind the window, behind the curtain. I see that. That was what I was thinking, but I was like, I don't know, maybe that's her resting in the shoulder. Oh, what a pretty picture. Next day, a boat went speeding over the narrow channel of water that separates Pomona on the mainland from Hoy. In it sat a woman, but who she was or what she was like, no one could say, for she was covered from head to foot with a black cloak, and her face was hidden behind a thick, dark veil. Snorro the dwarf knew her. Remember that Snorro the dwarf? He was in this story. Do you remember that? Such a Scottish thing. Ramble off. And then you're like, oh, this is the same story. Snorro the dwarf knew her, even before she laid aside her trappings, for Countess Fraukirk was no stranger to him. In the course of her long life, she'd often had occasion to seek his aid and help her in her evil deeds, and she'd always paid him well for his services in yellow gold. He therefore welcomed her gladly. But when he had heard the nature of her errand, his smiling face grew grave again, and he shook his head. "I've served thee well, lady, in the past," he said, "but methinks that this goeth beyond my courage. For to compass an earl's death is a weighty matter, especially when he is so well beloved as the Earl Paul. Thou knowest why I have taken up my abode in this lonely spot, how I hope some day to light upon the magic carbuncle. And thou knowest also how the people fear me and hate me too, forsooth. And if the young earl died, and suspicion fell on me, I must needs fly the island, for my life would not be worth a grain of sand. Then my chance of success would be gone. Nay, I cannot do it, lady, I cannot do it." But the wily countess offered him much gold, and bribed him higher and higher, first with wealth, then with success, and lastly she promised to obtain for him a high post at the court of the King of Scotland. And at that his ambitions stirred within him. His determination gave way, and he consented to do what she asked. "I will summon my magic loom," he said, "and weave a piece of cloth of finest texture and of marvelous beauty. And before I weave it, I will so poison the thread with a magic potion that when it is fashioned into a garment, whoever puts it on will die ere hath worn it many minutes." "Thou art a clever knave," answered the countess with a cruel smile lighting upon her evil face, "and thou shalt be rewarded. At last we have a couple of yards of this wonderful web, and I will make a bonny waistcoat for my fine young earl, and give it to him as a Yuletide gift, and then I reckon that he will not see the year out." "That he will not," said Dwarf Snorro with a malicious grin, and the two parted, after arranging the piece of cloth should be delivered at the palace of Orfear on the day before Christmas Eve. Now, when the Countess Fraukirk had been away upon her wicked errand, strange things were happening at the castle at Kirkwall. For Harold, encouraged by his brother's absence, offered his heart and hand once more to the Lady Morna. Once more she refused him, and in order to make sure that the scene should not repeat, she told him that she had plighted her troth to his brother. When he heard this was so, rage and fury were like to devour him. Mad with anger, he rushed from her presence, flung himself upon his horse, and rode away in the direction of the seashore.
While he was galloping wildly along, his eyes fell along the snow-clad hills of Hoy, rising up across the strip of sea that divided the one island from the other, and his thoughts flew at once to Snorro the dwarf, who he had occasion, as well as his step-aunt, to visit in bygone days. "I have it!" he cried. "Stupid fool, that I was not to think of it at once. I will go to Snorro, and buy from him a love potion, which will make my Lady Morna hate my precious brother, and turn her thoughts kindly towards me." So he made haste to hire a boat, and soon he was speeding over the tossing waters on his way to the island of Hoy. And when he arrived, he hurried up the lonely valley to where the dwarfy stone stood, and he had no difficulty in finding its uncanny occupant, for Snorro was standing at the hole that had served as a door, his raven on his shoulder, gazing placidly at the setting sun. A curious smile crossed his face when hearing the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned around, and his eyes fell on the young noble. "What bringeth thee here, Sir Earl?" he asked gaily, for he scented more gold. "I come for a love potion," said Earl, and without more ado, he told the whole story to the wizard. "I will pay thee for it," he added, "if thou wilt give it to me quickly." Snorro looked at him from head to foot. "Thine must the maiden be, Sir Orator," he said, "who needeth a love potion to make her fancy so gallant a knight." Earl Harold laughed angrily. "It is easier to catch a sunbeam than a woman's roving fancy," he replied. "I have no time for jesting. For hearken, old man, for there is a proverb that saith, 'Time and tide wait for no man,' so I need not expect the tide to wait for me. The potion I must have, and that instantly." Snorro saw that he was in earnest, so without a word he entered his dwelling, and in a few minutes returned with a small phial in his hand, which was full of a rosy liquid. "Pour the contents of this into the Lady Morna's wine cup," he said, "and I warrant thee that before 24 hours have passed, she will love thee better than thou lovest her own now." Then he waved his hand as if to dismiss his visitor, and disappeared into his dwelling place. Earl Harold made all speed back to the castle, but it was not until 1 or 2 days had elapsed that he found a chance to pour the love potion into the Lady Morna's wine cup. But at last, one night at supper, he found an opportunity of doing so, and waving away the little page boy, he handed it to her himself. She raised it to her lips, but she only made a pretense at drinking, for she had seen the hated Earl fingering the cup, and she feared some deed of treachery. When he had gone back to his seat, she managed to pour the whole of the wine on the floor, and smiled to herself at the look of satisfaction that came over Harold's face as she put down the empty cup. Her satisfaction increased, for from that moment she felt so afraid of him that she treated him with great kindness, hoping that by doing so she would keep in good graces until the court moved to Orpheus, and her own true love could protect her. Harold, on his side, was delighted with her graciousness, for he felt certain that the charm was beginning to work and that his hopes would soon be fulfilled. A week later, the court removed to the royal palace at Orpheus, where Earl Paul had everything in readiness for the reception of his guests. Of course, he was overjoyed to meet Lady Morna again, and she was overjoyed to meet him, for she felt she was now safe from the unwelcome attentions of Earl Harold. But to Earl Harold the sight of their joy was as gall and bitterness, and he could scarcely contain himself, although he still trusted in the efficacy of Snorro the dwarf's love potion. As for Countess Fraukirk and Countess Helga, they looked forward eagerly to the time when the magic web would arrive, and out of which they hoped to fashion a fatal gift for Earl Paul. At last, the day before Christmas Eve, the two wicked women were sitting in the Countess Helga's chamber, talking of the time when Earl Harold would rule alone in Orkney, when a tap came to the window, and on looking around they saw Dwarf Snorro's gray-headed raven perched on the sill, a sealed packet in its beak. They opened the casement, and with a hoarse croak, the creature let the packet drop on the floor. Then it flapped its great wings and rose slowly into the air again, its head turned to the direction of Hoy. With fingers that trembled with excitement, they broke the seals and undid the packet. It contained a piece of the most beautiful material that anyone could possibly imagine, woven in all the colors of the rainbow and sparkling with gold and jewels. "'Twill make a bonny waistcoat," exclaimed Countess Fraukirk with an unholy laugh. The silent Earl will be a braw man when he gets it on." Then, without more ado, they set to work to cut out and sew the garment. And all the night they worked, and all next day, till late in the afternoon, when they were putting in the last stitches. Hurried footsteps were heard ascending the winding staircase, and Earl Harold burst open the door. His cheeks were red with passion, his eyes were bright, for he could not but notice that, now that she was safe at Orpheer under her true love's protection, the Lady Morna's had grown cold and distant again, and he was beginning to lose faith in Snorro's charm. Angry and disappointed, he had sought to his mother's room to pour out his story of vexation to her. He stopped short, however, when he saw the wonderful waistcoat lying on the table, all gold and silver and shining colors. It was like a fairy garment, and its beauty took his breath away. "For whom hast thou purchased that?" he asked, hoping to hear that it was intended for him. "Well, 'tis a Christmas gift for thy brother Paul," answered his mother. And she would have gone on to tell him how deadly a thing it was, had he given her time to speak. But her words fanned his fury into madness, for it seemed to him that this hated brother of his was claiming everything. "Everything is for Paul. I'm sick of his very name," he cried. "By my troth, he shall not have this." And he snatched the vest from the table. It was in vain that his mother and his aunt threw themselves at his feet, begging him to lay it down, and warning him that there was not one thread in it which was not poisoned. He paid no heed to their words, but rushed from the room, drawing it on, ran downstairs with a reckless laugh, to show the Lady Morna how fine he was. Alas! Alas! Well, what do you think happened? Scarce had he gained the hall, than he fell to the ground in great pain. Everyone crowded around him, and the two countesses, terrified now by what they had done, tried in vain to tear the magic vest from his body. But he felt that it was too late. The deadly poison had done its work, and, waving them aside, he turned to his brother, who in great distress had knelt down and taken him tenderly in his arms. "I wrong thee, Paul, for thou hast been true and kind. Forgive me in thy thoughts," and he added, gathering up strength for one last effort, and pointing to the two wretched women who had wrought all this misery. "Beware of those two women, for they seek to take thy life." And then his head sank back on his brother's shoulder. With one long sigh, he died. And when he learned what had happened and understood where the waistcoat came from and for what purpose it had been intended, the anger of the silent Earl knew no bounds. All things I believe, lots of anger in Scottish people. He swore a great oath that he would be avenged. Of course he did. Not only on Snorro the dwarf, but also on his wicked stepmother and her cruel sister. His vengeance was balked, however, for in the panic and confusion that followed Harold's death, the two countesses slipped out of the palace and fled to the coast, and took boat in haste to Scotland, where they had great possessions, and where they were very much looked up to, and where no one would believe a word against them. But retribution fell on them in the end, as it always does fall, sooner or later, on everyone who is wicked, or selfish, or cruel. For the Norsemen invaded the land, and their castle was set on fire, and they perished miserably in the flames. Bet you didn't see that coming. When Earl Paul found that they had escaped, he set out in hot haste for the island of Hoy, for he was determined that the dwarf, at least, should not escape. But when he came to the dwarfy stone, he found it silent and deserted, all trace of its uncanny occupants having disappeared. No one knew what had become of them. Few people were even inclined to think that the dwarf and his raven had accompanied the Countess Fraukirk and the Countess Helga on their flight, but the greater part of the islanders knew and held to the belief, which I think was the true one, that the powers of the air spirited Snorro away and shut him up in some unknown place as a punishment for his wickedness, and that his raven accompanied him. At any rate, he was never seen again by any living person, and wherever he went, he lost all chance of finding the magic carbuncle. As for the silent Earl and his Irish sweetheart, they were married as soon as Earl Harold's funeral was over. That makes it sound like they literally walked out of the funeral into a wedding. And for hundreds of years afterwards, when the inhabitants of the Orkney Isles wanted to express great happiness, they said, "As happy as Earl Paul and the Countess Morna." And that's the story of a great big stone in Scotland called the Dwarfy Stone. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed those tales. I tried to pick things that weren't too cliched on the whole Christmas thing. Obviously, I have, how many weeks till Christmas? I think we have around 5 weeks till Christmas, and a lot of the tales, I will tell you now, are obviously very Christianized. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. It just obviously means that they wrap themselves around the same story in different ways. And so it's not always that interesting to hear. So I will continue to try and find, winter tales of pagan origins, which are a lot more varied and strange, or at least folktale origins. I'm also pondering reading The Christmas Carol, which I'm sure 1,000 other people have done on YouTube. It's long, but I was thinking of doing that over a series of streams closer to Christmas, just because I really do like Dickens. He's not my favorite writer, but I do like him. I do like that tale. And I just thought maybe you guys would like to hear that version of it. I know it's a bit of a cliche. So that's something I was thinking about for the sort of final week before Christmas. There are even stories for New Year's that are specific about New Year's, because that is a thing as well. GS says, great story about the Dwarfy Stone. Excellent characters. Yeah. It's the same thing I think I was talking last week. It's strange in fairy tales that sometimes these traditional folk tales, they're like, oh, that's some folktale nonsense, and the characters are very light and they don't have a lot of motivation, and they just kind of want to do good things, or they want to do evil things, and they get a magic thing and they're fine. But ever so often you find these folk tales that are like full tales. With fully realized characters and complex relationships, and that is something that really stood out for me about the Dwarfy Stone. As a person who sews, I'm going to leave on this thought. The thing that stood out for me, though, was how could you sew poison cloth and not be poisoned? I mean, you handle that stuff more than the person who wears it, honestly. I think the description of the Bonnie waistcoat also was really beautiful. And I would love to know if anybody has actually made something that looks like it. Or drawings of it or whatever else. GS says, yes, this could be a movie. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's been made somewhere. This is not obscure at all. Dwarfy Stone is a thing. And I'm sure if you went there, they would tell you this tale. Sometimes I tell these tales and I feel like, well, they were collected, but they're pretty obscure. But this is definitely one of those occasions where it's a fairly standard
Like, you could go to modern Scotland or the island of Hoy, and if you asked people about the Dwarfy Stone, they would tell you about Snorro. Like, it's that kind of standard. Okay, well, we all know what happens when I ramble. Now that you've seen stories from the culture that I pull most of my genetic material from, you might better understand why we ramble. It's in the blood. Ramble and hold grudges. There is Scotland in a nutshell. So that brings us to the end of the show. Obviously, we're going to do a lot of Christmas stuff. If you don't know me, I love Christmas. I'm sorry if that's not your thing. I guess I will be alienating that part of my audience, small as it is, if it's not your thing, because I really like Christmas. Oh, Thursday. We are going to have a blast on Thursday. I don't want to say anything more than that. Come back on Thursday at 6:30. We're doing a choose your own adventure. So you'll want to be there. Like we did for Halloween. I don't know if you can guess what it's about. GSS Snorro, my new favorite villain. He's very handsome too, apparently. Anyways, there we go. I'm rambling like the old man that I'm becoming. Thank you so much for everybody coming by, and I hope you have a good sleep. There's beds ready in the cabin. Good night to you.